thanks very much for inviting me to this talk. I was a bit surprised. The adoption output, or the adopted output that came out of this work was dates to December 2017, so it's 2.5 years ago. But I was pleased because I think this issue of sustainability and then drilling down further into that challenge, how do we make things sustainable? How do we make data infrastructures sustainable, and particularly data repositories? Drilling down into that challenge and understanding income streams and business models remains and will remain an incredibly important topic. So I think I was asked to do this, and I think the process that we went through with this output shows the adoption of a report and a process that started as part of an RDA group being picked up by an international policy organization, OECD, and shepherded through that process also by an organization which is a partner to RDA, of which the members are also often members of RDA, and which shares a lot of the RDA vision and activities. So the end result, as I said, was a report that was published in 2017 by OECD and CODATA, because we, or CODATA, sort of led it through the final stages of that project. But it started actually as a WDS, that's the World Data System Working Group on Cost Models, way back in 2013, and that very quickly became a joint RDA WDS interest group on income streams for data repositories. I'm just going to move my control panel there a moment. It was an interim report on income streams because what we decided to do was that we really needed to understand how data repositories were funded. And so we conducted a preliminary set of interviews to understand what their income sources were and how they packaged that into business models. As part of that process, we ran a series of workshops, some of them at RDA events, and in Paris in 2015, Carthage Smith of the OECD Global Science Forum came to that workshop. He was really interested in the approach, and in particular the methodology, the relationship with interests of OECD, not just the economics, but also the science policy dimension. And so we discussed further with Carthage, and I suppose the adoption happened in that transition from this RDA and WDS interest group with its preliminary work into a project that was funded by the OECD Global Science Forum with additional support from CODATA. And that led to the report in 2017. So there's the report, and there's the DOI. So the first thing I would do is suggest to colleagues on the call, if you're interested in sustainability and you're interested in the things that contribute to sustainability, in particular analysis of income streams and business models for data repositories, then please have a look at the report and consider the recommendations. So why is this important? Digital data infrastructure, of course, is essential to research, to science, and is a major issue, therefore, for science policy. The role that data repositories play in that is extremely important. And with the growth in the volume of data, the reuse of data, all the things that we're concerned about, there is the issue of how do we sustain these resources, how do we pay for them. Now, I don't know, if you've been around in this community for a while, maybe there are some bugbears you have, things that you say, oh no, not it again, not that question again. We're not going to start talking about carrots and sticks again, are we? And one of my bugbears, one of the things that irritates me is when we talk on a very shallow level, I think sometimes, about sustainability and how things are funded. Oh, we need to fund this. We need to provide resources for this. The questions are more complicated than that, in my view. And this report and the activities was a way to try and unpick some of that complication and to look in a little bit more detail at how data repositories are funded, where they get their sources of funding from, and above all, how they package that together into a business model which demonstrates their value proposition. And so hitherto, before this report, relatively little had been done on sustainability. Some stuff on sustainability, some stuff on value proposition, very little, in fact, on income streams and on business models. And that's the gap that we try to address. So the guiding questions for our activity were: how are data repositories currently funded? How do the different mechanisms of funding affect sustainability? Are there particular streams of funding which are more likely to lead to sustainability or not? Are there any new and emerging income streams for data repositories? Can we optimize costs? And what should we say about that? And how, above all, do the income streams match willingness to pay of various stakeholders? And how can we combine them into a sustainable business model? So the co-chairs of the final project with OECD were Ingrid Dillo, who's now one of the co-chairs of the RDA Council, and myself, Executive Director of CODATA. The two of us had actually been the co-chairs all the way through, from the original WDS working group to its transformation into the RDA interest group and then into the OECD project. For the OECD project, with the extra resource and that adoption process, we were able to take on 2 consultants who did a lot of the work and the writing and the analysis, and that was very important to deliver a meaningful report on the basis of the initial work that we've done. They were Paul Uller, who's until the end of this month is the chair of the CODATA Data Policy Committee, and he's worked with us a lot on a number of reports, and he was formerly at the National Academies in the USA, and an economist, John Houghton, who's done a lot of work on the economics of open data and the economics of open access. And of course, as an OECD process, we had representatives from OECD member countries, expert representatives from the organizations that relate to the OECD. We conducted detailed interviews with 47 data repositories to understand their funding models, their business models, their income streams, and their concerns about sustainability. We ran 2 workshops, the first with a SWOT analysis, the second with a presentation and a discussion of the economic analysis, which in the meantime had been conducted by John Houghton and by the co-chairs and by members of the expert group. The report was drafted, final iterations, a lot of backwards and forwards and discussion with the expert group and the Global Science Forum and the OECD until it was published in December 2017. So some definitional things as I've launched into this presentation, I've been talking about income streams and business models and data repositories. There's a couple of slides here which I don't want to spend too much time on, but the important task of definition, what are we concerned about? We weren't talking about all research infrastructures or indeed all repositories or organizations that may provide access to data. We were particularly concerned with how do we fund those organizations that perform that essential stewardship function and then make the data available for reuse. So that was an important criteria because there's an increasing variety of data providers of various sorts and of research infrastructures. Also business models and revenue sources or income streams. Definition of business model there. And what we were concerned about was to understand the revenue source or the income stream. How do we pay? And from where does the repository receive its income? And the finding was that those income sources are far more varied than we might initially have suspected. And the issue is if those income sources come from various sources, how does that affect the policy of the repository? How does it affect its sustainability? And again, how is it packaged together into a business model? So the key contributions of the report, I think, were the summary of the findings from the 47 repositories and the SWOT analysis, and something that's unique and original, and I'm sure has not been done before, is actually shedding light onto precisely how the repositories are funded. So even that, I think, is relatively significant. But also in the analysis, there's the typology of the revenue sources, a discussion of the value propositions and how those value propositions can be articulated, criteria to assist the preparation of business models for research data repositories, and of course, because the OECD is a policy organization and serves policy messages to its member governments, a set of 5 detailed policy recommendations. So I'll run through some of these key features of the report. I think in the interest of time, relatively quickly. The slides will be shared and the report is accessible. So please look into that for further detail. But I think even this relatively simplistic and dreadfully primitive diagram is nevertheless a useful insight into the variety of funding sources that we uncovered for research data repositories. I think it's often imagined that research data repositories receive what we termed structural or largely depend upon structural infrastructure funding. There's a single contract, often renewed every 5 years, with a major research or infrastructure funder. And although that is largely the case, the proportion of repositories' income that covers, we found actually was smaller than we might imagine. There are additional sources of income from hosting. By that I mean the organization that hosts the data repository, whether it's a university or a research center, often provides additional income. Sometimes there's repositories we found were exploring new sources of income. Annual contracts with depositing institutions, for example, is being explored. Data deposit fees, as an analogy to article processing charges, were also being explored by a number of data repositories. And there are, of course, a number of data repositories which still charge for access, that have a membership model of some nature. And a very significant, or a more significant part of the income that we might have expected, and certainly from the perspective of sustainability we might have hoped, was the amount of income that data repositories receive from short-term projects and how reliant they are on that. And there's also a notable feature of private contracting of various services to parties other than the core funder. I won't go into this slide a great deal, but this is the slide which is intended to communicate the process of making the value proposition. So this was part of the recommendations that came from the report. So above all, or the starting point, to identify at the bottom there, really identify the revenue sources. Also, and all these things are interrelated. Identify the stakeholders, develop the product service mix, identify the cost drivers and match that to revenue and resources, and above all, demonstrate value and make the value proposition. That diagram is explained and unpacked a lot more in the report, but I think it serves as a useful checklist for data repositories who are thinking about their income, who are thinking about how they communicate their value proposition to stakeholders, and how they work to ensure their sustainability. And we hope it's also of use to policymakers to understand that process and dynamic. This is taken from the report as well, is criteria to assess the sustainability of research data repository business models and some of the considerations involved in designing from the perspective of a data repository in designing that business model. There's detail there that I won't go into now, which is in the report. And also we did, through the workshops and through the economic analysis, a study of the pros and cons. We started off with a SWOT analysis of each income stream and business model, and then tested that through the workshops. And this is the summary list of the pros and cons of different revenue sources and how they might be packaged into business models. And again, I won't go through that detail in this presentation, but it's there in the presentation and there in the report. So I'll close with the 5 recommendations that came out of this work. In the report, those recommendations are unpacked considerably, and there's sub-recommendations and they're explained. So here, they might seem rather bald or apparent, motherhood and apple pie, etc. But there's explanation that sits under these, which I think is relatively useful. First, of course, all stakeholders should recognize that research data repositories are an essential part of the infrastructure for open science. That should be evident. That in order to ensure their sustainability and to be maintained at that essential part of infrastructure, they should have a clearly articulated business model. That it's incumbent on policymakers and research funders and other stakeholders to consider the ways in which data repositories are funded, and to take into account the advantages and disadvantages of various business models in different circumstances. And that's a lot of the detail in the analysis in the report, which I think is useful. The research data repository business models are constrained by and need to be aligned with policy regulation and incentives. And the type of funding sources affects the situation of the data repository in the research environment and the way in which the data repository acts. A lot of data repositories spend a lot of time chasing project funding. Is that their core business? And in the context of financial sustainability, opportunities for cost optimization should be explored, of course. So I think that's the core of the presentation. That's an introduction to the report and the output, and charts some of the history of how that evolved from a WDS activity to an RDA activity. That RDA interest group gave us the chance to test some of the ideas, and they were picked up and then adopted by the OECD Global Science Forum and with the support of my organization, CODATA. When this slide deck is shared, there are some slides after that thank you slide which unpack those recommendations and provide some of the justification as well that I didn't go into for the origins of the report and the lack of work that had been done in this area. Thank you very much.